Let's discuss modern versus classic fantasy. Hey Anthony, how you doing? Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're keeping safe, I hope you're keeping healthy, I hope you're keeping active. Welcome to not quite another episode of Amazing Worlds, but rather a rant, rather a rebuttal, rather just sharing my thoughts and my opinions on a topic which I actually wanted to do after my last review of the First Law trilogy. If you watched it, link in the description below, and hopefully something happening here. And then, very much as I finished that book and I was thinking about modern versus classic fantasy, then the Daniel Green video crept up. If you don't know him, really big booktuber. He puts up very regular content, pretty knowledgeable guy by the looks of things. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but I think it's worth checking out for sure. Daniel put a poll on Twitter about when do we think the divide between classic and modern fantasy took place, and there were several options there, and there was this guy, Anthony. I don't want to give any more details. I don't really want to, make it personal, but he made a claim that Dragonlance set the path down which all modern fantasy is walking down. And if you haven't seen my earlier videos on Dragonlance, I really love Dragonlance. It's really got firmly, a place in my heart. I raved about Legends of the Dragonlance. Check my videos again there and the description below. But this guy was just, making this claim. And I knew that Twitter is the place where conversation goes to die. I said, don't get involved, don't say anything. And I just replied back and said, look, I don't think that's the case. Dragonlance, for what it is, it feels pretty classic fantasy. And this guy just started down this route. Oh, you haven't read the books. It's like, oh my God, of course I've read anyway. Then you haven't understood them and this and that. And taking a fairly patronizing / derogatory tone with me, and like my wife knows, don't get involved, and I was like, oh yeah, fine. So I didn't want to get stuck in a yes no conversation on Twitter. But this kind of guy seems like the kind of guy that wants to have the last say on everything. So whenever he tweeted back to me, I would just reply kiss kiss kiss, like love, peace and love. I really, it is not proper conversation. You're not giving me argument. You're just spouting statements unsubstantiated. So kiss kiss kiss. But then I thought back and I thought, look, the reason I'm there, the reason I started the channel is because I wanted to have conversations, civilized discourse, exchange of opinions. So I said, let's give him a try. I said, look, pick one of the videos in my channel. And my intention there was to bring the conversation out of the constraints of the Twitter characters and have a much more lengthy, open exchange of ideas, conversation. I chose not to, or maybe I didn't express myself correctly there. And obviously he had his last say, and I just went, whatever. And then he was also quite derogatory about how many followers I've got in my channel, and of course I've got very few followers and stuff like that, which, whatever, So I thought, let's take the opportunity here. Let's address a few things. Let's talk about modern versus classic fantasy. Anthony, I'm gonna give you my views as to why I don't think that Dragonlance is as great as you think it is. And for the record, just to be clear, I love Dragonlance, but I honestly don't think it's set down the path of modern fantasy. Okay, and if you disagree with me, I'm more than happy. But let's have a conversation. Let's keep it adult. Let's keep it reasoned, and let's exchange ideas. Okay, that's the whole point here. And by the way, just to get this out of the way, yes, I do have very few followers in YouTube, but I am very aware of the constraints I work in. I don't have fancy equipment. I'm not a booktuber. I'm not hoping to make a living out of this. I bought the cheapest video camera I could find on Amazon to get started. I'm married, I've got 2 little boys, 1 and 4 years old. I've got a full-time job that, even though I've spent the last 3 weeks confined in my home because of coronavirus in Spain. We are not allowed to go out. I'm still working full time. I spend 8 hours a day connected to my computer doing my job. So this for me is a hobby. This is something that my wife said, why don't you give it a go and put yourself out there, and I did, and I'm enjoying it. It's a fancy ride. I'm learning new skills and stuff like that. And if I get a few followers, and if I engage with people and I can exchange ideas, that's great. And that's all I ask for. I'm never going to set up a Patreon. I don't have any aspirations of anything of the sort. So you trying to demean me like that is not going to work. It's not going to have an effect on me, because I've got much bigger things to worry about. Well, anyway, to start the conversation, I think it's very important that we define the terms that we're talking, okay, that we are on the same page. Because if we disagree on the fundamental basis of the conversation, then obviously we're not going to see eye to eye. We're going to disagree, but then at least we can pinpoint it down to say, well, this is what I think modern versus classic fantasy is. And if we disagree on the definition, then that's fine. That's okay. But let's agree to disagree on that point. So, did a little bit of research, because I have my opinions, but did a little bit of research. And obviously, this is not very academic. I don't think fantasy generates a lot of paperwork or, studies and other stuff. Although, Brandon Sanderson is a university professor. Tolkien was, and C.S. Lewis were professors, and so there's that. But turns out, actually, my opinion of what modern fantasy is very different from what other people think modern fantasy is. So it turns out that fantasy has been there forever. It's not a 20th century thing. And actually, when I read this article, looking back on it, it did click in my mind. Modern fantasy has been there since the Renaissance, almost. I mean, in the book Don Quixote, which I've read, before you say a couple of times, I'm Spanish. It was compulsory reading at school, and then I read it for pleasure again later. Don Quixote goes crazy because he reads these chivalry novels that make his mind turn to mush. And there's a chapter in Don Quixote where they are burning these books, and the local priest is giving his opinion on each and every single one. The Amadís de Gaula and a few others, and some get saved from the burn, and some of them get burnt. And so it turns out that fantasy has been there forever. Obviously, the notion of what we understand as fantasy has evolved over time. You could argue that there are elements in Lovecraft, or authors prior to Lovecraft, Bram Stoker's Dracula, all these sort of more horror fantasy, vampire, ghost stories. Would you consider that fantasy or not? Presumably in this day and age we wouldn't, but at the time, it was there. Now, so there you go. That's what people call classic fantasy, like Renaissance style books or medieval books on chivalry. There you go. I consider modern fantasy, if I had to pinpoint it, and this is a fairly arbitrary point, and there's always, the difficulty, the danger of putting a specific deadline on something is that, what about, why not 2 days before, why not 2 days after, why not 1 year before, why not 1 year after? And, it's a risky business, but I'm going to put a date on it, and I would say that modern fantasy started with The Hobbit, with Tolkien's The Hobbit. And prior to that, or sort of concurrent to that, you had, The Adventures of Conan by Robert Howard. So, those sword and sorcery tales published in pulp magazines of the 30s, they were there, they existed prior to The Hobbit, and obviously Lord of the Rings. And then you have C.S. Lewis, who was drinking buddy of Tolkien with Chronicles of Narnia, and so on. So presumably, I would say, between The Hobbit and at some point in the 90s, which I'm not entirely sure when or how, well, maybe, if you want to put a date, maybe with the starting of the publication of Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, that could be considered maybe the transitional beginning of modern fantasy. Okay, but what are the differences? What is classic versus modern fantasy? The way I understand it, the way I conceive it, in classic fantasy, what you have is a very heightened sense of the fantastical. The world creation, I think, demands a lot from the reader in terms of suspension of disbelief and having that theater of the mind where the action takes place. The world of Tolkien, the world of Lewis, is very, very fantastical. We've got, minotaurs, centaurs, orcs, goblins, elves, dwarves, halflings, hobbits, talking animals. There's all sorts of, fantastical, mythical creatures happening in there. Whereas I think in more modern fantasy, a lot of that has been lost. So if you have a look at Brandon Sanderson, Brent Weeks, who in my opinion is a Sanderson wannabe, bit cutting, bit hurting, but my opinion, Robin Hobb, Trudy Canavan, Scott Lynch, Brian McClellan, these are the authors I've read more modern times, Joe Abercrombie. There is a clear lack of that fantastical element. Now, according to that distinction I just made, Dragonlance firmly indie classic fantasy. The world of Dungeons and Dragons, highly fantastical. Classic fantasy, a lot of the stories revolve around the classic mythical hero's journey, an unwilling hero that gets thrust in the spotlight to carry out a task, perform a mission, fulfill a deed that he is reluctant to do. He gets put through stress and duress and eventually overcomes the odds, comes out strong and wins the day. Okay? Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, very clear. Bilbo and Frodo are reluctant heroes that fulfill the deed. Modern fantasy, we don't necessarily have a hero as a protagonist. The person that saves the day isn't necessarily our main character. In fact, a lot of the times our main characters die, or they really aren't the heroic type. So, classic point in case, Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb, my video somewhere there. Fitz is not the main hero of the story. He's a mere observer. Sanderson, Mistborn. Vin dies at the end. She is not the one that changes the world and makes it into a better place. Take A Song of Ice and Fire. Classic, representative, prime example of modern fantasy. Our good guy, our hero, Eddard Stark, dies in book 1. Characters that you think villainous or evil that you certainly dislike at the beginning, Jaime Lannister, you end up rooting for books later, at least I did. So what we have is a very different treatment of character. We go from the ones you cheer for, you root for, the heroic, impersonation of good characters, to grey characters. People are morally ambiguous. Song of Ice and Fire, prime example. Joe Abercrombie, First Lord Trilogy, very grey characters. Scott Lynch, Gentlemen Bastards, these people are thieves, for God's sake, you're rooting for the thieves. Back to Dragonlance, the characters are very clear in their intentions. They are sort of a bit like in Lord of the Rings as well. They are embodiments of certain virtues. Caramon is an honest, caring, loving sibling. Flint is our very endearing, classic, grumpy grandfather figure. Stern Bright Blade is the honourable knight who dies a heroic death, sacrifices himself. One of your arguments was that, Tanis was this great character that abandoned his friends to go and have sex with his evil ex-girlfriend. I never saw it that way. I don't buy that argument. When I read the books for the first time, even as a kid, I knew that Tanis was never going to betray the party. Tanis, the reason he stayed with Kitiara was to protect the rest of the party. He never betrayed them. He never gave them up. He never pointed them out. He did what he had to do, and it was a horrible thing, possibly, that he had to do in order to protect the others. Stannis was always a good character. Even to the point, I would say that Stannis is very much an Aragorn-like character. The similarities are there. Aragorn is a human raised by elves, and he's got this sort of split duality between his elf heritage and his human heritage, because Aragorn isn't even entirely human, he's a Dunedain. The Dunedain are kind of like a high race of humans that live longer than your average human, and they are closer to the Valar than normal humans are. Stannis being a half-elf, he's got that sort of split duality going on. He feels human, he's attracted to Kitiara in his youth and the brothers, but he's raised by the elves, so he's fighting that, but very much Aragorn-like. Okay, yes, okay, Raistlin, but Raistlin is evil from the word go. We can see that. Okay, now in classic fantasy, I think the treatment of character is characters are less developed. Plot is more important. The fulfillment of the story. In modern fantasy, characters, character arc, character development, character journey is more important, or is or drives the story more. I think in classic fantasy, characters are more reactive to events, and in modern fantasy, characters drive events by their actions. Song of Ice and Fire, Mistborn. So that's the difference. And again, there with Dragonlance, the party are just reacting to the reality of the events happening in Kryn, the return of dragons and the gods, and how they go about it. And they find their place, and they are naturally the good guys fighting the bad guys. One of your arguments about Dragonlance being dark, being modern, is that good doesn't defeat evil. Well, it kind of does. It kind of does. The good guys defeat the bad guys. Takeshi's the Queen of Darkness does not get back to the world. She is defeated by the good guys, by Caramon, by Stannis, by all the guys. Okay, maybe it just so happens that good doesn't prevail. The balance is restored. But that's the point. Good has prevailed over evil, and the balance is restored again. That's a theme of Dragonlance. It's a world where neither good nor evil prevail. There's a balance. So it is a very classic tale of good versus evil in Dragonlance, which is why I think that Legends is the superior tale, as I mentioned in my video earlier. And also, you have to remember, Chronicles of the Dragonlance just came from the TSR campaign setting for Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't even meant to be a story or a trilogy of books. It was just the adventure that Wise and Terry Phillips and a few others played and got turned into books. And a Dungeons and Dragons campaign is not there to develop character. It's just a set of action pieces that move the characters from level 1 to level 10. Even Raistlin, probably the most iconic, the most endearing character in Dragonlance, isn't a Margaret Wise or Tracy Hickman creation. He was created by Terry Phillips, who was the person that originally played him in the Dragonlance campaign. And the character was fully formed. The characters don't really develop in Dragonlance. They don't. Caramon remains a goody two-shoes throughout all books. Sturm is already a noble knight before being a knight. Raistlin is evil throughout. He just uses people along the way to fulfill his aims. But even in the Soulforge, the meant precursor, backbone story to a backstory to Raistlin, Margaret Wise struggled to make him grow because the character is so fully formed, even in the prequel, the Soulforge story, that there is very little character development there. The Kender, Tasselhoff, he doesn't learn anything. Kender are immune to fear. They're just there for the ride and for the sense of adventure and the fun. And Tasselhoff is just used as a MacGuffin to get the plot going. Maybe towards the end, in the War of Souls and stuff like that. Maybe, but in the first 6 books, Tasselhoff doesn't really learn anything. Flint is an old dwarf by the time Chronicle starts. He doesn't learn anything. Possibly, the more interesting characters in terms of development and arc are the secondary characters, are Gilthanas and Laurana. But they are secondary characters. They're not the main piece of the books. They don't really go through that. And then finally, another one of the differences that I find between classic and modern fantasy is the magic system. So in classic fantasy, magic systems are very soft. So again, if you haven't done so, you can check Sanderson's lecture on soft versus hard magic systems. Narnia, Tolkien, Earthsea, soft magic systems that are there to enable the plot to move on, as opposed to the hard magic systems that Sanderson and Weeks are trying to put forward. The Dragonlance magic system is a classic soft magic system. So I failed to see where, in the Gentleman Bastards, in Robin Hobb's Fitz series, in Brent Weeks' Night Angel or Lightbringer, in any of Sanderson's stuff, I failed to see the influence and the impact of Dragonlance. Please tell me where it is, because I can't see it. And don't tell me I haven't read the books. I have, repeatedly, several times. And I think it's perfectly fine for you to love Dragonlance. I do, and appreciate them, but appreciate them for what they are. For what they are, not for what you want them to be. Think about it. Dragonlance is not too different from the Dark Elf series by Salvatore. It's not. It's just pure Dungeons and Dragons. It's just a product to sell the game. Eventually, the product outgrew the game, perhaps, but that's all it is. It's just a fun ride. It's just Dungeons and Dragons. Tell me, honestly, point me out in modern fantasy, in Scott Lynch's work, in Robin Hobb, tell me, Brent Weeks, Sanderson, tell me where is the Dragonlance influence. You talk about dark themes in Dragonlance, yes, because we have Lord Soth. Well, he just seems to be a bit of a Nazgul type figure. You know, just because you have an undead knight doesn't make it a dark theme. You know, Lord of the Rings had the Nazgul, had the Balrog. You know, with the Silmarillion, if you want evil themes there, or dark themes. Yeah, man, I don't know. And like I said, these are my reasons. This is what I consider are the differences between classic and modern fantasy. And these are my reasons why I don't think Dragonlance is modern fantasy, not even a stepping stone between the two. What can I say? That's my opinion, these are my reasons, and I'm more than happy to engage in conversation. Don't tell me I haven't understood, because also the beauty of the books is that people, you read them at different times of your life, they can be inspiring to different people in different ways, and that's great. But your understanding of them doesn't make it superior to mine, just because it's your understanding. In the same way, of course, that my understanding of them doesn't make it superior to yours. But here are my reasons, here's my discourse, here are my opinions why I think the way I think about Dragonlance. Anyway, long video, I'm sorry if it was a little bit ranty, but you know, I hope you get to see this, I hope you get in touch, I hope we can have a conversation. There's no hard feelings at all, you know, I'm here just for the opinions, for the exchange, for the conversation, for the coffee, and you know, waiting to see what happens, what comes after, what to read next. I hope you're all keeping safe, I hope you're all keeping fine. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, let me know, and as usual, Anthony, even you, if you press the thumbs down button, if you dislike, tell me why. Let's have a conversation. Until next time, take care, have fun, enjoy, see you, bye.